Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you may be listening from. This is your host of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, Michael Cross, with another interesting and hopefully thought-provoking episode. And before I begin, I just encourage people to check out my YouTube station at Michael Cross and, look up the one that has references to freedom from conscience, and also my website where I write about a whole variety of things, including some of the topics that we're going to discuss tonight, and that you can find at michaelcross.net. Now, tonight we have a return guest. You may have remembered her from a few weeks ago when we were dealing with the topic of, forces that seem to be unleashed against parenthood and family and so forth. And that's, let's see, how do you pronounce your first name again? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's Ayla.
Ayla, that's right. And tonight it's going to be something totally different, isn't it?
Yes. Quite different.
Okay. Now, the thing is that there's a lot of research that's been taking place in something that maybe a lot of people didn't know a lot about maybe a few years ago. And because of the internet and alternative media and a lot of different really popular websites talking about things like Illuminati and so forth, there's been kind of this rebirth of an interest in ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer and Rome and a lot of the gods and goddesses, especially goddesses, very interestingly enough. And maybe it's because of, again, it seems like, whenever you hear about Illuminati and so forth, you think of a lot of the characters such as ISIS, and I'm not talking about the terrorist group, Inanna, and the California one. Who is that? Minerva. That's right. Okay. So, Ayla, what is your background in the study of this kind of topic, goddesses and so forth?
Yes, well, I have an undergraduate degree in German with a minor in anthropology, and I started studying ancient religious traditions when I was a teenager, but when I was doing my undergraduate degree in my anthropology courses, I focused a lot on ancient religions. Particularly, I was very interested at that point in my life in Native American practices, and so I delved into a lot of their rituals and their concepts of the divine feminine when I was doing that. And then when I went to get my master's degree, I got a master's degree in women's spirituality. And, of course, for that degree, just studied the divine feminine in all traditions all over the world. So in Europe and in ancient Egypt, we studied the divine feminine aspects within Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, etc., all the major world religions. And, of course, it was heavily focused, a lot of the study on the Greek, the Roman, the ancient European goddesses, because there's just so many of those. Of course, also many goddesses in African traditions. So that was definitely a main source of focus for my studies in that regards. But I was a practicing pagan also at the time, sort of a Dianic tradition. And for those who aren't familiar with paganism, there's many, many different traditions. But Dianic is sort of an umbrella term for those who follow a goddess fairly exclusively. They either don't acknowledge a god at all. They either don't acknowledge a masculine form of the god at all, and they only acknowledge a goddess, or they acknowledge the goddess as superior to or more important than the masculine form of god. And so I had originally entered paganism through a more Celtic or Pictish practice in my early teens, which was more masculine and feminine, was very equal in that tradition, and then sort of got into the Dianic path in my early 20s, So when I was doing my master's degree, I was at that point in my life a Dianic tradition, Wiccan or pagan, and I was also a columnist for a journal, a pagan journal that comes out quarterly called Sage Woman Magazine, which is usually fairly well known amongst pagan and goddess tradition people. It's something you can pick up at Barnes and Noble and that sort of thing. And so I had a regular quarterly column in that publication at that time as well. So that's my background as far as that goes. I'm currently now a Christian, though. I converted actually during my master's degree, while I was getting that towards the end of my master's degree, converted to Christianity, and that's a whole other subject in and of itself. But that's my background in the subject matter that we're going to discuss.
Mm-hmm. Now, really quick here. Now, the thing is, I think a lot of people consider pagan or Wiccan or something like that, and they immediately get these images of like Satan worshipers and stuff. That's not really a correct way of seeing it, is it?
Oh yes, not at all. Not at all. Wiccans, neo-pagans don't even believe in a Satan, let alone worship him. So yeah, that's kind of a popular movie imagery that was used in a lot of horror movies, especially since the 1950s, to kind of use occult symbols, such as the pentagram and other things like this, and associate them with devil worship. And of course, it also dates back to things such as the Salem witch trials and in the height of the witch hysteria that happened amongst European cultures, both in Europe and America, which associated things like herbal healing and certain practices like that were sort of holdovers from a pre-Christian past with devil worship, which was, it wasn't the case then, and still isn't the case wasn't the case in the 1900s, but it was used in popular media just to evoke a fear response, mostly in horror movies. And so that's where a lot of people get that misconception. But there's absolutely no devil or Satan in any neo-paganism or Wiccan traditions.
Yeah, I mean, but the you mentioned the thing there about herbal healers and stuff, and even in the pre-Christian era, like in Greece, there was a time where mathematics was seen as a form of sorcery, wasn't it?
Yes, that's true. Right. A lot of those early Pythagorean and folks like that were definitely seen as holding some kind of, extra worldly knowledge or magic. And of course, in most societies, I think this is typical around the world, you'll see that anytime someone holds some kind of extra knowledge, special knowledge, or superior intellect, quite frankly, which I think is what was mostly happening over in Greece. I think they skewed very high for very high IQs in that population genetically. And those people that were very brilliant and could understand these concepts that the layman couldn't, the layman immediately wanted to ascribe some form of evil to it. And I think that that's kind of unfortunately, a natural human response that we see in, cultures worldwide. Yeah,
I mean, that surprised me when I found out that, and it was fairly recently actually, that Pythagoras, he had disciples, mathematic disciples, and they were executed. He got away, I think, but his disciples were actually exterminated by the Greek authorities. So, yeah, yes. There's this kind of thing about, being worried about this special powers or something like that.
Yes, definitely. I think it's human nature that to try to destroy what you don't understand. And I think that that's been a struggle amongst people who have a special spiritual insight, or a certain intellectual insight that is above and beyond or outside of what their community norm is. They're going to face persecution, prosecution, quite often death for having such ideas, beliefs, or what people would term as secrets, which usually typically aren't necessarily secrets. They're just things that the layman isn't able to understand or is unwilling at that point to get past their cognitive dissonance to try to understand and try to grapple with on a mass level, individually, of course, because obviously people like Pythagoras had converts to his way of believing and had followers, as you mentioned. But for the mass, population, they're kind of grabbing their torches and pitchforks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm wondering, I don't know if you've studied this that much, getting back to that topic I was talking about with esoteric traditions, and then I'm going to go a little bit farther, more into the 19th century. But Pythagoras, I believe the traditions are that he had found ancient knowledge, and maybe things dating thousands of years back, and there seems to be this kind of thing you hear a lot now, where people are thinking that there's, the various secret societies and so forth, that they are in some way, trying to connect to this ancient past. Some traditions, I think, trying to go back to a pre-Noah advanced Atlantean society and so forth. Is this something that attracts people that you've seen that they got attracted to this idea of goddess worship and trying to find what these secrets are that are still out there?
Yes, definitely. I have seen it, but I think it's a less frequent version of the people that are attracted to the goddess worship. And this might just be my own perspective because of my background and where I come from. And of course, I'm an American. I grew up in America. My master's degree was in San Francisco when I got that. So my perspective is from people that were in San Francisco. So we're talking about baby boomers who were looking towards the goddess as a religious expression of their political ideology. They rejected this notion of patriarchy and hierarchical power structures, and so they were looking for a religion or a tradition or a faith that now fit their political ideology and their political activism. And so the people that I know mostly were the ones that were going back to goddess worship as a way of resurrecting this concept of the divine feminine in response to what they saw as a masculine-dominated society, and wanting to counterbalance what they saw as a destructive Christianity with its, male God and its male savior with something feminine in their lives, both personally and then also politically, and as a tool almost of conversion for other people to join their movement politically and spiritually. And so those are the bulk of the people that I've met in the movement. But I got my master's degree. It's been almost 10 years ago now. And so I've really seen a shift, and I've seen a cultural shift overall, but I've really seen a dramatic shift towards people now, especially younger people in their 20s that are looking towards goddess-oriented traditions, really looking more towards, as you were saying, trying to find that ancient wisdom. They don't come at it as much with a political agenda anymore like the baby boomers did. They're coming at it as really wanting to find something true and something authentic, and recognizing, again, as you had said, that people like Pythagoras had obviously some really incredible knowledge that superseded his place in time, and trying to figure out where that came from. And I think for some people, they tend to look at genetics or DNA or IQ. And then some people, they want to go towards ancient knowledge, that idea of Atlantis, that idea that somewhere in our ancient past there was this amazing amount of knowledge that we've now lost overall, and that there are these special individuals throughout time and history who, for whatever reason, were able to tap into that knowledge, whether that is because it was continuously handed down in some secret form, or because they spiritually were able to divinely tap into a source of knowledge. And I've seen that sort of goddess interest rising, and it's always been there. I mean, not to say that there hasn't been people there haven't been people always looking for something more authentic, but I do think that the goddess movement and people searching for the goddess really got co-opted politically by feminism in the 60s and 70s, and was derailed quite a bit that way. And now we have, as that ideology is kind of fizzling out, especially amongst the youth, we have people really searching for that ancient knowledge.
So this sounds like a throwback then to the mid to late 19th century. I know that I took a pseudopsychology course in a graduate level pseudopsychology course, and what surprised me was the professor spent a long time on how popular these like secret societies were amongst the rich, the famous, religious leaders, kings and queens and so forth. And, of course, some people may have heard of some of the individuals that sprang out of these things, like, Blavatsky and Crowley and people like that. But it seems that it kind of faded away maybe around when the wars took place, World War I and II, but it seems to be getting kind of a rebirth of people getting really interested in this kind of thing.
Yes, definitely. I think when you look throughout history, I think that there was definitely some, I mean, you can see in the early 1800s there in America, there was definitely kind of this seeking of ancient knowledge happening, a big spiritual revival movement happening at that time. And and especially as you get into the Victorian era, you get closer to 1900, we definitely see a lot of people, famous people in particular, like you said, getting into the occult, trying to find this ancient wisdom or these secrets, recognizing that a lot of people, like a lot of the founding fathers had been Freemasons and in secret societies such as this. I think, a lot of those wonderful imagery of the Victorian era of ghosts and specters and that sort of thing, that you can conjure up crystal balls, and a lot of famous men had wives that were holding seances weekly, and it even goes into the Tsar of Russia at the time, Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, famously his wife was I don't know, classify her as maybe a devotee, but a follower of Rasputin, who was Orthodox Russian Catholic, but he had very strange ideas for the time, kind of was obviously mixed some of the ideas of Catholicism with sort of that fertility cult past of paganism, and things like that in his behavior and in his ideas and philosophies. There's definitely that idea of that ancient healing wisdom and so forth. So we see that it just ebbs and flows. It seems throughout human history, in all time and all places, you can see this resurgence of these secret societies, or the interest in them, in the occult, in bringing kind of older shamanic practices into more traditional modern Western practices, as Rasputin sort of was doing. And you just see that kind of happen throughout human history. I think it's very interesting, and you can look at it from a spiritual perspective or a psychological perspective or even a genetic perspective and try to answer as to why that happens. But it's definitely something that's over and over reoccurring. And I think it's great that you pointed out that it did die off with the war. And I think that also you can see that with the Civil War. Like, as I was saying, in the early 1800s, you had a lot of people, particularly in North America and upstate New York and in Pennsylvania and areas like this, trying to uncover some of that ancient wisdom. There was a lot of interest in kind of like Black Forest traditions, Germanic spirituality that had kind of been brought over into Pennsylvania during a lot of immigration there, particularly people, Mennonites or people that were claiming to be Mennonites who actually weren't exactly Mennonites, but were practicing something a little bit more like a folk magic, an ancient German folk magic. You had that happening. And there was a lot of interest in that in the early 1800s in America. And then you had the Civil War happen, and things kind of got derailed. And some societies that were able to kind of separate themselves from the Civil War were able to attain that idea of continuing to seek for deeper knowledge. And I think an easy example is the LDS, or the Mormons, who left the East Coast and went west. So they weren't particularly involved heavily in the Civil War, though they did contribute soldiers and a few things like this along the way. But their spirituality seemed to continue to progress, or their spiritual seeking pretended to progress in that community, which is one of the things that built it up so large into the state of Utah that we have today. But then you have the ones on the East Coast and in the South who were engaged in the Civil War. You see a die-off of that. You don't see a lot of people during the Civil War turning to occult practices or spiritual practices or heavy study into, trying to find this ancient divine wisdom, because they were fighting for their lives. And then as the Civil War wrapped up and you've got a couple, another generation coming up, and then you go into the pioneers and Little House on the Prairie time, and then you go into the Victorian era, you see a resurgence of that again. And so I think it's really important to point out that that pursuing this knowledge is always a matter of luxury for society, and you can see those patterns of pursuing that knowledge when society is fairly stable, and then just literally not being able to do so during a time of war.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's the whole Maslow hierarchy of needs. Survival comes out at the base. Hey, now, an interesting point I want to bring out for listeners, and it's really amazing. Most people have never considered it. Is don't we have like many of our days of the week and our months actually have a pagan origin in the names, don't they?
Oh, yes. I think that anyone who sat down and started to parse out what was pagan in our modern day lives would be absolutely shocked and overwhelmed at how much of our terminology, our language, and our practices, even daily, our holidays, things like this that go back to paganism. But yes, our calendar, and the days of the week, Thor's day is, Thursday, Freya's day, Friday. So, that for me is a really fun one, because the days of the week being from the Nordic tradition, a lot of the paganism that we see in Western cultures comes from Rome and Greece, predominantly. And with Nordic traditions maybe being third on that list of how much influence it has on what we have today. But for me, I absolutely love the Nordic deities. They're just so much fun to read about and to teach my kids about and to think about. And they even make for the best popular media, I think, of shows like Vikings that the History Channel has done recently. That's been quite successful. It's because there's just something really, really fun about those Viking gods and those Nordic gods and goddesses. So yeah, the days of the week, Thor's day and so forth is a great example of that. But it's throughout our entire culture, really, our entire year, and many of our holidays.
Well, even a lot of our symbols. I mean, for those listening in California, I mean, the California flag has Minerva on it.
Right. Yes. And I'm here in Utah, and we have Beehive. We're the Beehive state, and of course, bees and honey, and the making of mead with honey. And there were lots of goddess cults throughout, early Europe, that were devoted to bee goddesses and fermenting of honey to take in order to experience a higher, state, of spirituality, to see into other realms, or to, access divine wisdom. And it's quite carried over into that idea of women getting together and working towards a common purpose, which is very symbolized in my state flag with the beehive. And the beehive is supposed to symbolize, community, getting together in a community and working hard for the main goal and the main objective. And what I think is really fun about that too is, of course, when bees are working together for their main goal and their main objective, it's the queen bee, right? Which can be kind of a symbol for a goddess, divine feminine, a mother in heaven, queen of heaven. And so I think a lot of people participate in this symbology and have absolutely no idea how there is another layer below and a layer below that if they want to continue digging into the meaning of these things.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we could go back to, I've seen depictions of the beehive all the way back to ancient Sumer.
Oh yes, yeah. It's extremely ancient.
Yeah, and another thing is, the thing I find interesting about Minerva is it does tend to get associated when you hear people talk about secret societies and so forth. But it seems that one thing that Minerva, Inanna, maybe Freya, I'm not sure, but you have a duality of fertility and sexuality, but also war and conquest associated with the goddesses, correct?
Yes, you do. There's so many different reasons that could be, so many different philosophies around that. A lot of the information that we have about goddesses is often can get mixed up. Let me think how to put this into words exactly. So when we're uncovering information about these ancient deities, it's based on anthropological research, which is not a hard and fast science unless you find an actual document that you can kind of confirm the date on and you've got a really great translation of. It's really hard to kind of pin down the exactness of what god was which, what goddess was which, and what attributes they contained. And there's definitely, we can go and we can, sort through the relics and say, okay, most of the time Athena or Minerva, as she was known in Rome, seems to have been linked with wisdom and the arts and trade and strategy. She was born with weapons, out of the head of Jupiter, and she was, clothed in weaponry. But then and so we can kind of ascribe these attributes to her, but there's also kind of the problem in that when uncovering some of this information, some of these goddesses either used to be gods originally and they kind of transformed into feminine characters, and maybe the battle and the weaponry were holdovers from that, or they have a counterpart, and this happens a lot with Freya and Frigga and Frigg. When you're looking at the anthropological sources, if you go back to books in the 1940s and things like this, they'll say that Freya, Frigg, Frigga was masculine. It was originally believed that was a god and not a goddess. And so sometimes there's just simply an overlap of not quite parsing out what a gender was ascribed to what personality. And we're talking about a span of hundreds, if not thousands of years, for these ancient deities, and so they mutated, they changed, they grew, their stories changed as other cultures influenced the culture worshiping them. So as other outside influences were coming into Rome or into Greece or into the Vikings as they were raiding different areas, we see different concepts being brought back from other areas and changing these deities a little. So it's really hard to really pin down why that is. And of course, then there's just also the other spiritual aspect of it. If you're looking at it a little bit more artistically and spiritually, and that these goddesses were showing an attribute of women that is definitely true, that women are the bearers of fertility, obviously, but that because of that, we can be quite fierce. And there's a connection there. I think now in our modern society, we tend to separate out fierceness and weaponry and war from fertility. And I think that we forget that living in a pre-modern era, your fertility had to be protected, and and most of the time this was protected by the men in your tribe, your husband, your father, your brothers, etc. However, in the absence of that, when they're at war or when they're out hunting and there's a danger, mama bear instinct, as we would coin it in modern terms, really comes out in women. And definitely women are not physically as strong as men in general. Obviously, strategy and battle planning are not our mental strong suits, definitely. But we do have a reserve of amazing skills when it comes to protecting our young. And I think of stories of, mothers in car accidents where the car is rolled over and they suddenly have the strength of 10 men and they just rip the door straight off the car in order to get their children out. And we hear stories of that unusual strength, that sort of instinct that just can come out of that. And so personally, I tend to think that within the goddesses, when we're talking about their weapon and their weapons, their wisdom, their skills in war, things like this, I tend to think of it as more of a feminine attribute in the protection of their fertility and the protection of their offspring and their children.
Well, that's an interesting take on that. That would explain. That would actually explain then the duality. I read somewhere that I think it was the Aztec culture that the warrior and the mother were seen as the roots of the society for obvious reasons. So,
yes.
After war, you got to make babies. And it's probably the reason why most societies, in fact, pretty much all of them until, recent times, women were not allowed to go into combat unless it was like you were down to your village was pretty much surrounded and you had to have everyone fight.
Oh, yes, exactly. Because not only are women needing to rear the children and birth the children for your society to continue, but when the men do go off to war, when all of the strong, able-bodied men are gone, that leaves a village or a tribe extremely susceptible to kind of a sneak attack from the enemy, coming up from behind and conquering those vulnerable people. And so there's definitely this idea that what strength women do have and what strength we do possess, it does need to be reserved for that battle around home and hearth.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of the strength, again, at least the nominal amount of research I've done just, as a hobby, on, again, we go back to these societies and so forth that seem to place a great deal of symbolism around, like I said, Isis, Ishtar, Inanna, Minerva. There seems to be one thing that seems to connect them in the sense that there was this idea that women had a special insight into spirituality. Even amongst, like the Egyptians were a male priesthood, there was still this kind of belief that the females had a special power. Is that something you've encountered in studies that seems to be something there?
Oh, definitely. And this is something that it holds true cross-culturally and throughout history, that there is some special connection with women and the divine. It's really undeniable. Even if you look at just modern society, women tend to be overwhelmingly more engaged in church activities and in spiritual pursuits than men. And I think that it's very interesting. If you look, and again, there's multiple reasons for this. You could get into the science of it and say, well, of course, men and women's brains are just wired differently, and women's brains are wired in a more interpretive way, in a more artistic way, in a more symbolic way. We're the ones that are weaving, we're the home arts and things like this, which again is why, goddesses like Minerva are associated with arts and things like that. But also, and then men's brains tend to be, more analytical, more based with, more in general structured towards mathematics and engineering. And so women's brains naturally, there's, this kind of idea that our brains just naturally understand these concepts, these more creative concepts of religion a little better, or they just work a little better in our brains. So there's kind of like the science-y aspect of that. And then there's the spiritual aspect of that. And for me, being a spiritual person, a believer in God, this spiritual aspect is really amazing for me, particularly the way it relates to birth. And I think that one thing that happens cross-culturally and throughout history, obviously, is that women give birth. Even in modern society where women giving birth is actually discouraged, we're discouraged now in the Western world from having children, most women still tend to want to have children and still do have children. I forget the exact number. I still think it's in the 70s, like 70% of all women will have at least one child in their life. And so we have the childbirth. And childbirth is an experience that is wholly unique unto women. Men can never experience it. And of course, men have their own experiences that are wholly unique unto them. But for women, we give birth. And men, they have these new sciencey things where they hook men's abdominal muscles up to these electro probes to try to simulate what a contraction feels like. I've seen a few of these on television. It's quite comical. But again, as much as modern technology can try to simulate it, men don't know what it's like to give birth, both from a physical perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective. And there's both of those things happening when a woman gives birth. And one of my best, one of the best terms that I've seen it placed in, or one of the best metaphors, let me say, one of the best metaphors for this giving of birth is this death and resurrection, is this dying to self and this coming back with new life. Because for any woman who's gone through, now I had my children at home, so I gave birth at home, so I didn't have an epidural, I didn't have a C-section, I didn't have any of that, so I went through the entire process naturally as God and nature intended. And there is this moment in birth, and in the home birth communities, they call that the wall, when you hit the wall, when you think you cannot do this, you cannot go any further, no matter how many children you've had, and you really get to this point where you feel like you can't go any further, and that's really a point of death. You die to self. You no longer care about yourself and whether you even survive what's going on, because it is so physically overwhelming. But you completely die to yourself. Your ego is gone. You don't care whether you live or die. You care completely and wholly about your child as it's coming into the world. And this was quite shocking for me when I gave birth to my first child. I did not realize how egotistical I had been before that moment of, I will die. I will allow my physical body to die to this pain I'm experiencing. And as long as my child lives, that is the only thing I care about right now. You care not about your own death at all in that moment. And that is a uniquely feminine experience that women throughout history and cross-culturally most of them have experienced because they've given birth to children. And that gives us a unique perspective, I think, on this death and resurrection, which is a common theme throughout most world religions. And it also, I think, spiritually, we have to go into an otherworldly place. I honestly think women's spirits, when they're going through a natural birthing process, go into as a Wiccan would say, a time without a time and a place without a place. I think we kind of slip between the worlds. And anyone who's watched a woman give birth or even been in the room when a woman is giving birth has experienced this. There's this thing in the home birth community where we talk about losing time. And it's like that last hour before the baby is born really feels like 5 minutes to everyone. You lose time. You quite literally lose time, and not only for the woman giving birth, but for the people present in the room. It's an amazing experience, and that's why you'll think you gave birth at 2 o'clock, and you look back, and it was actually 2:45 or whatever. It's really fascinating, and I think that's because there is this literal spiritual veil that we pass through when we're giving birth, and I think part of that is retrieving our child wholly from the spiritual world, which they've still kind of had a foot in at that point, and bringing them into the physical world. And that gives women an incredibly unique perspective on divinity. And to hold that baby in your arms for the first moment after you have literally gone through hell and back to bring that life into the world, you know how God feels about us. You just know. You can't, it's undeniable. so I think that is why women overall tend to be more spiritual throughout human history.
And that may explain why the Egyptians, for instance, the pharaohs, they would have them do the thing where they would seal them up as if they had died and leave them just to the point of almost dying, from lack of oxygen. Mm-hmm. And then, open the crypt up and then bring them out, kind of as a resurrection. I guess that's the closest thing you can get to that sort of ritual.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, they even do this, psychologists do this today when people, especially children, have had trauma. This idea of rebirth therapy is known in the world of psychology, where you kind of bind the child, you hold them down or you wrap them in pillows, and you kind of take them through a rebirthing process where they need to push their way out of that again. That symbology is just, all over. And you think of evangelical Christians and their obsession on being born again. When you talk to an evangelical Christian, that's all that they're focused. Are you born again? Are you born again? Are you born again? There's this idea of this death and resurrection being something that we see cross-culturally and throughout history in almost all religions, and it being associated with this birthing process as well. And we see it both within the scriptures of major world religions, in their phraseology and in the terminology that they use, and also in their rituals, as you pointed out, with the Egyptian ritual, for example.
Okay. Hey, we only have a few minutes left, but speaking of, you brought up the thing about having once been involved in stuff like Wicca. The star thing. I know rock groups, have taken various symbols and kind of made it sound like, oh, these are satanic. But in reality, you can go to ancient churches in Europe and you've got pentagrams upside down, pentagrams upside up. What is the difference between the pentagram that's facing up and down, aside from what rock groups might try to promote?
Well, there's a lot about that. Pointed up is sometimes referred to as it being a feminine aspect, pointed down as being the masculine aspect of that symbology. Also, there's just different things. Pointing up would mean a negative. I'm reversing it. Pointing up would be positive, something you're trying to attract. So if you were trying to promote something like healing or good energy or things like that, you would use it pointing up. If you're trying to rid yourself of something, a bad habit, or if you feel like you've been cursed, someone's put a hex on you, that sort of thing, then you would use it pointing down, and that would be something to get rid of it. Also in religious or ritual symbology, they would use it if you were trying to get a job, that's you're trying to gain something, attract something to you, you use it pointed up. If you're trying to lose your current job in order to move on to something different, then you would use it pointing down in your ritual. So, but there's a lot. You could have volumes of books could be written on the different symbology of that. But essentially, the star, what I like how I like to explain it to people with the star inside the circle is it is just this ancient symbol of how we all go back to this one source. And you think of fruit, and you think of all the religious ideas of the tree of life that permeate religions throughout the world. And if you take, and usually it's an apple tree quite often. And you take an apple and you cut it in half horizontally instead of vertically, you get that star in the middle. I think we've all done that in kindergarten class, kind of, where we cut the apple in half and we see the star. Well, and then if we think about the whole apple, well, the star's inside of a circle. And that's kind of an idea of the root of all people, of the seeds, of the fruit, of the tree of life, of the beginning of all things, kind of coming from that symbology of that star within that circle. And then also, there's, the basic elements to human existence. You've got earth, wind, fire, water, and spirit. And so the 5-pointed star also represents that for most cultures that use it, just as an idea to show that we are all kind of held with it, circled within these main 5 areas of our life.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it's not like the whole, devil worshipping thing, although they may use that, it has something far deeper and far more ancient.
Oh yes, yeah, and any honest Satan worshiper that uses the pentagram, they know that they're using it incorrectly. They part of Satan worship, I think, is one of the things that they do is grab symbols from other places, even symbols like the crucifix, and use it to their own devices as a means of kind of symbolizing their control over these other paths and these other traditions and these other wisdoms, and that's just something that they do. That they take in the pentagram the same as they took the crucifix, and they use it in rituals that are meant to stimulate you in a negative way and provoke a reaction. It's a very reactive path.
Okay. One last thing here. Statue of Liberty. Cute statue, or does it have something to do with goddesses?
Well, she's a goddess. Yes, definitely. The Statue of Liberty is, she is the Roman goddess Libertas. And, getting into the birth of America, it's everywhere. You go to Washington, D.C., and, these ideas of justice being blind and holding out the scales. She's also a goddess. You have goddess imagery all over the founding of America, but particularly the Statue of Liberty. She's a really great one to point out.
Okay, that's really interesting. This has been really, really, really fascinating. I'd like to, thank you, Alana, for coming on tonight.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's been really fun to kind of be able to talk about some of these things that I don't often get the opportunity to talk about.
Okay, well, I'm sure the audience there really appreciates it, and hope to, I'll hopefully have you back on in the future.
Yes, definitely. I would love to.
Okay, well, you take care now.
Okay, thank you. You as well.
And welcome back to the last segment of our show here on UCY TV Productions. This is Michael Cross, and this is Unlock the Door Radio. Before we get into the topic that I think will be quite interesting, I'll just encourage people to check out my website. We're at michaelcross.net, where I have written quite a bit on, a variety of subjects. You'll have to come and check it out. As I said, michaelcross.net. Anyway, what I thought I would talk about a little bit here is because I was having a discussion with someone just the other day, and they asked the question, can a psychopath feel sympathy? Or when they see a car wreck, will they, and they see someone all bloodied up and laying there in the road, and, but still alive, in pain, would a psychopath just sit there and just stare like, I don't know, a robot and not feel anything? And actually, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. But here's where we get into something that really is confusing, and that is the difference between sympathy and empathy. Okay? My contention would be that all human beings can feel sympathy, except for a very, 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 very tiny percentage. Maybe a psychopath that scores a 40 out of 40 on one of the psychopathic checklists. But that's very rare. The thing is that I think 99% of the population feels sympathy. But now empathy is a totally different thing. It's rooted in the same Greek term pathos, which, essentially kind of means to feel with someone or within. And to be quite, many people don't realize this, the word sympathy really didn't even come into the English language until the mid-1500s. And essentially a very broad definition, kind of a connection between people, kind of a sense that you feel pity. You kind of feel bad when someone else is feeling bad. You even, probably this would motivate you to help them. But now, empathy is a totally different thing. In fact, it didn't even come into the English language until around, it was around the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s. There was this guy psychologist named Edward Titchener, And he translated a German word, which basically was like feeling into. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the German. And he translated it into empathy. And that's basically goes a little deeper than sympathy. That means you actually feel what the other people that might be hurting are feeling. Now, it doesn't mean if someone's leg is laying there on the ground that you're feeling, your leg's hurting. But it means that you're feeling like, oh my gosh, that could be me. And you're thinking, oh, that is so horrible. And the empathy is that you will do what it takes to, usually this is the motivation, you'll do whatever it takes to help the person, because that could be you. And, I did a show a while back it's on my YouTube channel, called like The Dangerous Side of Too Much Empathy, or if I can remember right. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But you see, there's the difference. Now, again, sympathy, empathy. Let me give you an example, aside from the car wreck, that might help illustrate this. Let's say you're a young woman. Your best friend has been engaged to this guy for like 2 years. And all of a sudden she gets a phone call while you're there that he's going to break up with her. Doesn't want to see her again. And the thing is, here's the difference. With the empathy, you may start crying with her and holding her and feeling, oh my gosh, and you really do feel it. In fact, even emotionally, you will have an emotional response, the same endorphins, hormones and stuff. If you were feeling sad, if your boyfriend had broken up with you, you'll feel that. Okay? You're kind of on par with that person. It's almost like emotionally you've blended into them. Okay? There's some sort of, Mr. Spock mind meld type thing. Now, sympathy, on the other hand, would be, wow, that's horrible. How could that guy have done that? And you feel bad for your best friend because, of course, it's everything from it's just spoiled the evening that you guys had planned, or it has, or you really do feel bad for her because, she's your best friend. But it's not going to be sympathy if you start saying, you know what, he was just a jerk anyway, or there's better guys out there, or at least you're so attractive you're not going to have any trouble finding another guy. I was just going to say, if you're a psychopath, you're probably going to try seducing your best friend in that situation. But anyway, the thing is that ultimately that is the big difference that I think a lot of people mess up. And so let's put this in a leadership perspective, because I said this a while ago, well, a couple weeks ago is when I put the video up and did the radio show, that it actually might be more dangerous to have a political leader that really has a lot of empathy than it would be to actually have a psychopath. Because, see, the psychopath thinks in terms of cost-benefit analysis. What's good for, let's say, it could be their image, or it could be the country, or it could be, they want to be successful. So maybe it's their place in history as a leader. So they're not going to want to mess up. Empathy, on the other hand, too much empathy might mean, oh my gosh, there's poor people in the society. We need to start helping them at all costs. Or there's lots of people that around the world that are poor, and maybe you have so much empathy, you're thinking, if we could only bring all these millions of people here and put them to work in whatever we can, and if we can't put them to work, we have a good welfare system to take care of them. That is empathy. Now, the thing is that between the two, it's up to you which you would rather have. Now, if you think of an example, I was trying to think of a movie example or something, but ultimately, I can't think of anything right offhand, but ultimately, it gets into this idea that does it make the person who's low in empathy any less sympathetic? No. I mean, they still will feel bad if they go through a poor neighborhood and see poor people. Empathy-wise, if they're high in empathy, they're ready to do anything, tear down everything, sell off the nation's assets to help those poor people. And there's where ultimately the difference is. So a person that would rank high in empathy would be someone who, whenever they see something that is what they perceive as something wrong, they feel guilty if they don't actually do something because they're so connected that, of course, guilt comes along with it. Okay? It's not necessarily synonymous, but it's often, I hate to use the word comorbidity because that makes it sound really bad, but it is something that is connected. It is associated with it. Whereas a person can have incredible sympathy, but not really feel all that connected to the person. This could be one of the reasons why surgeons and emergency room doctors tend to score fairly high on tests for psychopathy. Okay, now people are like, well, I thought that was just serial killers. No, there's a lot of jobs that attract psychopaths or people that are high on the psychopathic scale. Okay, you don't have to be a psychopath to still be high on the psychopathic scale. Maybe you take one of those tests and you wind up with a 15 or a 20 or a 25. You know, in most places you wouldn't be considered a psychopath in that case. However, a lot of emergency room doctors and surgeons. And it could be the fact that they're not freaking out when they have someone that's, you know, all torn up. And they're thinking more in the lines of, well, I really feel bad this person has been hurt, but now I have a job to do. And they're not thinking about, oh my gosh, if he or she dies, the family's out there, they're going to be crying. What am I going to do? I can't mess up. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Okay? Actually, just to be fair to doctors, general practitioners, you know, people that you go to the office, you know, when the kid's gotten hurt or something, but it's not something, you know, it's important, but it's not necessarily that, you know, whole big life-threatening thing. They score actually amongst some of the lowest when it comes to psychopathic levels. So this is just a generality, but according to the test I've read about, if you have a doctor who is, you know, general practitioner, they're the ones that are going to feel your pain for real, whereas some of the others who are under more highly stressed situations maybe not so much feel your pain at a literal, visceral level. I hope that helps people kind of understand the difference between empathy and sympathy, because it is a fine line, but it is important in trying to understand, especially this year, you know, when you're talking about psychopaths and politicians, whether they're presidential candidates, senatorial candidates, or even in Europe, prime ministers and that sort of thing. Anyway, that's all the time we have now, so I encourage you to come back next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Bye-bye now.
My name is S.M. Gibson, and I am the host of Anti-Media Radio on UCY.